Are you claircognizant, clairvoyant, clairsentient? While we all have the ability to tap into our clairs or our psychic centers, some of us have a harder time than others. And this is often due to issues of self doubt or really just not being able to trust ourselves and the messages that are coming through. So when we balance our energetic centers, our energetic system, we can greatly enhance our ability to tap into our psychic senses. So whether you are looking to enhance your own clairs or this is the first time you're hearing about them and you want to learn how to tap into yours, there's going to be something for everybody in today's episode. So, merry meet. I'm Aislin. This is Ask Aislin, and I am here tonight talking about the Clair senses. So, if you are joining me live, welcome everyone. You can leave questions and comments in the chat. We'll have a Q&A at the end. And if you like what you hear, leave a heart or a thumbs up somewhere in the video so we make sure this gets out to the feed of more people. And make sure to subscribe to us on YouTube, especially if you're watching this back later on YouTube. And that way you won't miss any future episodes. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in. I see some joining us in the chat. I see Misty's here. Hi, Misty. So I am going to start by talking about what the clair senses are, and then we'll go into the four main clairs in some greater detail, give you some ideas on how to work with your own, and then we'll also talk about some of the minor ones as well. So, what are the clairs? The clairs are psychic senses. Just like we have physical senses, we also have psychic senses. They pick up on information that's coming through the etheric plane most of the time. They're, we might say, coming through the subtle bodies because they're not as obvious as, for example, perceiving a sound with our ears or perceiving a sight or a color with our eyes. Now, like I said, they are similar to the physical senses in that they do still pick up some kind of stimuli coming from somewhere. This just happens to be different information. Now, some people would probably call this our intuition, and I think that that's a good way of defining what the clairs are. They're the modalities or the senses through which our intuition comes through. Now, this is different for everybody, and everyone is going to have clairs that are stronger or weaker than others. And our intuition depends on the proper functioning of these clairs or these psychic senses. So, if you are somebody who is feeling under the weather, for example, or don't have proper energy kind of flowing through your body, maybe you're feeling like you've got blockages or you're lacking in some areas, what you may find is that your psychic senses are not functioning as properly as they could be. And this has to do with the fact that our clairs are dependent on the life force or the prana or the energy that is moving through our bodies. Now, when the energy moves through certain chakras in our system, it may ignite a particular clair. So it's not uncommon for someone who is working with, let's say, for example, the solar plexus or the heart, and they've been working on that chakra for a while, and then all of a sudden they start to experience an amplification of one of their clairs, or for the first time ever, they start to pick up on messages coming from other places. This can be kind of confusing at first, especially if you're someone who's never experienced it before. I'll talk a little bit more later about my own story about thinking that this was somebody else's thing until one day I discovered that I had them too. And so I am a firm believer that everybody can tap into at least one or more, one or two clairs. But we're going to start off our discussion with the four main ones, and it's likely that anybody who's listening here tonight is going to relate to one or more of these. And I see a few others joining us. Hi, I see Amy's in the chat. Merry meet everybody. So again, leave questions, comments in the chat, and I'll be watching that as we go. So I'm going to start with Claire. Let's see, which one do we want to start with? Let us start with clairsentience. Okay, so I'm going to start with clairsentience because clairsentience is probably of all of the clairs, it's the one that the most people can relate to. And if you are somebody who is particularly sensitive, if you were somebody who was told that you were sensitive when you were a child, then clairsentience is likely to be one of your clairs. Now, clairsentience is defined as clear feeling, and it's the ability to feel the energy that's around us. And this can be our own energy. So, clairsentient people, when they're really tapped into this clair, they can sense their own energy really well, and they're very good at knowing what they need versus what they don't need. Now, it doesn't mean that every clairsentient is good at that all the time, because we'll learn later that there are ways that we can make this so that it's not functioning quite as optimally as it could be. And I know that for my own self, if my energy isn't in the right place, my clairsentience isn't really going to pick up things properly. Now, besides our own energy, we can also feel into other people's energy, and that's not just energy that they are vibrating, but also their emotional energy. So sometimes we define Clair empathy as something different. I'll talk about it briefly at the end. But in my opinion, Clair empathy, which is feeling other people's feelings and very clearly being able to feel them, I think falls under this main category of clairsentience, which is just feeling energy in general. Because if you think about it, emotions are simply just a form of energy. Now, clairsentience relates to the second and the third chakras, and I would also say the fourth chakra. So, a lot of the ones we're going to talk about today, we're going to be able to differentiate between whether they're kind of lower chakra related or they're upper chakra related. Now, clairsentience, just as it makes sense. We're feeling, we're sensing things. It has to do with these lower chakras. So people who have a strong clairsentient energy in them, they tend to come into the world feeling a lot. So if you are somebody who was told when you were little, you're too sensitive, you feel too much, you got to tamp that down a little bit, you are likely clairsentient, and many of you probably already know that. But anybody who is deemed too sensitive typically will find that they are clairsentient as well. Now, clairsentience is the first clair that we develop in the womb. So, when in utero, we are actually sensing, before we can open our eyes, we can hear anything, we're sensing the energy of our mother who is carrying us at that time. Now, after birth, we will continue to sense her energy if she was with us after birth, or whoever is raising us at that point will continue to sense their energy. But even during birth, even during our gestation in our mother's womb, there's so many important things that are happening here, right? So, mothers who are overly anxious will be able to pass some of that anxiety on to their child. Mothers who are very depressed, mothers who are going through really traumatic events will pass some of that on simply because as an infant, as a fetus, we can pick that up even before we are born. Now, that doesn't mean we're doomed if we had mothers who were overly anxious. I know that my own mother had an anxious pregnancy. It's not uncommon. Women who carry babies, they're worried. They want the best. They worry about the things they're taking in. But it does help to explain some of the anxiety that we may have later in life. It starts very, very early. Now, like I said, after birth, we will continue to pick up the energy around other people before we really can focus our eyes or we can really hear very well. Now, clairsentience is sometimes people will say clairsentience is like your gut feeling or your gut instinct. And it is very true. People who have a gut instinct are clairsentient, but I think that it's important to acknowledge that not all clairsentients have gut instinct. And for me, this was a game changer when I understood this, because I used to think that my clairsentience was happening in my stomach. It was the feelings I had in my stomach. And later I learned that those were anxiety. So, what is really important for a clairsentient is to understand where they are picking up those messages. Now, some people will feel them in their gut, and probably a large proportion of people will feel that in their stomach. But some people will feel it in the heart. Other people feel it in the head. Some people feel it, I know people who feel it in their arms and in their hands. So wherever that energy is being picked up or being sensed, it still can be clairsentience, even if it is not in the stomach. So it's important for us to learn where it is in our own bodies. Now, people who are clairsentient can usually read the emotions of other people. They don't always, they're not always in an optimal state where they're doing that well, but they usually can pick up on other people's emotions. So these are the kind of people like myself who, when they're in a large crowd of people, they need to learn how to either manage that, shield that a bit, or they're going to become very overwhelmed by everybody else's energy around them. Now, clairsentience will also tend to pick up on the collective energy of a place. So they'll be able to go into a place and say it has good vibes or it has bad vibes, right? And so if you're clairsentient, and maybe even you don't know you're clairsentient, but you've walked into a place and you said, you know what? We need to go somewhere else. This doesn't feel good. That is your clairsentience right there. On the other hand, you may walk into a place and say, wow, this feels good. I want to kick it here for a while. That is also your clairsentience. Now, clairsentient people often have a strong physical connection to their chakras. Now, what that means is that everybody can use their chakra system as a barometer as to what is going on for them energetically and therefore also physically. But a clairsentient in particular will be able to feel like a tightness in the throat physically when they need to work on their throat chakra. They might feel a tightening or stomach pain in their abdomen when they need to work on their solar plexus. So if you start to notice kind of pains creeping in and then eventually they lead you to working on that chakra, that is also your clairsentience. And again, I'm going to go out here and say, I think everybody is clairsentient. Some of us just don't know how to tap into it as well as others. Or many people have also spent a good lifetime being told to kind of ignore it, right? And so they become very disconnected from this sense. So it's kind of like you use it or you lose it, at least for the moment. This isn't a lifelong loss. But if we don't exercise the senses, we're not as good as understanding how to use them. Later on, I'm going to give you some tips on how you can strengthen some of these clairs within you if you're in that boat. Now, the other thing about clairsentience is that it is probably of all the clairs, it's the most easily confused with anxiety. People who are strongly clairsentient also commonly are anxious people. It's really because they're picking up on so much energy and they don't know how to manage it necessarily. So a person who wants to develop their clairsentience needs to learn how to differentiate anxiety from those clairsentient messages coming through. Now, if you want to develop your clairsentience, probably the best thing to do is to work with the lower chakras. For all of our intuition, we always want to work with the root. That is just going to go without saying. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But in particular for clairsentience, we want to work with the second, the third, and the fourth chakras. Now, you also want to work with your emotions, your own feelings and emotions. So, if you are somebody who has kind of really like fluctuating emotions and you're feeling very emotional, you want to try to tamp that down a bit, try to understand where the emotions are coming from, because we want to be in a pretty clear and grounded space when we start to really work with our clairsentient ability. Now, what I would recommend you do, and goes for anybody, like if you're already clairsentient, let's say you're quite good at it, maybe some of these tips you don't need, but if you're somebody who's kind of starting to understand, I'm clairsentient, but I'm not always really aware of the messages that are coming through, I'm not trusting them, what I would do is I would recommend writing down any kind of feelings that you have. Write them down, especially if you sense that it might be an intuitive feeling. And by this, what I mean is it's a feeling that comes through that seems kind of divorced from the situation that you're in right now. So if I'm just kind of sitting here and all of a sudden I have an overwhelming feeling of sadness, I'm not actually sad right now. So where did the feeling come from? So it could be that this is unconscious, maybe it's some kind of unconscious thing of my own that's coming through, but I also could be picking up this sad energy from someone else around me or even from the collective. Now, if you notice that feelings are kind of coming in like that for you, what I would recommend is write them down in a notebook. And this doesn't necessarily have to be journaling. It's just you're recording the date, the time, and sort of that feeling that's coming through. Now, at first, it's not going to look like much. It's going to be a record of a bunch of feelings that you have. But if you do this over several weeks to months, you're going to be better able to see how many clairsentient messages you're actually receiving. And you're going to be able to see if they're all the same or if they're different. And this is going to be very valuable information for you. Now, is you start to recognize them, and this goes for anything in the universe. If we start to recognize messages that are coming through, then we're going to start to see more of them. Otherwise, we're sort of like a radio that's tuned to the wrong channel, or like we're in between channels, right? And so we're really just picking up static. So it doesn't mean that we don't have the ability, we just don't have the radio finely tuned enough. Now, when we are really developing our clairsentience, in any of these clairs for that matter, we get that radio dialed into the right place because we're experiencing it and we're noticing these messages coming through around us. And this helps us pick up more and more of them. And it helps us honestly figure out how to more finely tune that channel. Now, what you also want to do, like I mentioned, pay attention to where the feelings are coming from as well and record that as well. And you'll be able to notice, is it in your stomach? Is it in your arm? Is it the backs of your hands? Is it in your throat? Is it in your heart? And then you're going to be better able to know when it's a clairsentient message and when it's just some other feeling that's yours, or it could even be anxiety. But you won't really know any of that until you start tracking this over time. So that would be my recommendation. It's going to be a kind of a similar recommendation for some of the other clairs, but we'll go into those in more detail. So I'm just going to pause for a second and check out the chat here. And I see some more people joining us. I see Kurt and Colleen are here, and Nancy. Hi, everybody. Jenny's here. Colleen said, I numbed my clairsentience through addiction to drugs and alcohol. I'm still struggling with tapping into it, even though I've been sober for many years. I feel like my shadow work, the shadow work I'm doing will help. And so that is a very important point, because many times, especially in clairsentience, but in any of the clairs, people will numb them through drugs and alcohol or other practices that keep them numb. And a lot of it has to do with it's just feeling so much or experiencing so much and not knowing where to go with it, not knowing what to do with it, maybe not having caregivers or people around us who can say, hey, yeah, that's clairsentience, and you can learn how to work with that. And so it's very common to reach for something that's going to kind of tamp that down and quiet that down for us. But, and as Colleen had said, it can struggling. She's been sober for many years and she's still struggling with kind of understanding how to work with her clairsentience. But you're absolutely right. Shadow work will definitely help. At the end, we're going to talk about clearing out emotional and energetic blockages, which will also help all of our clairs. Amy said, this explains why I have tremors when I'm around a lot of negativity. I just thought it was anxiety. It's probably, it could, some of it could be anxiety, but I honestly think some of it is also picking up other people's energy. And your body is reacting with some tremors. Yeah. So very common. Everybody's body reacts a little bit differently when they're in large groups of people, or can be around people that you don't know or people that you do know. But I think that what can happen is you start to understand something like that. Okay, when I start to have these tremors, this is me picking up on a lot of energy. And then you can have some strategies in place to help bring that kind of down for you, or at least manage it. But yeah, it can explain a lot. Okay, so let us go on to claircognizance, and and while we're at it too, if anybody wants to drop in the chat, if you consider yourself clairsentient, perhaps maybe you already know that you are, or perhaps this is your first time kind of realizing I might be clairsentient, because I'll tell you, I honestly thought this was all other people's stuff for the longest time. I thought I was just an anxious person, even after being a witch for 20 some years. I knew that I was very good, very good at teaching people about the craft, very good at leading people in circles. But I thought all this Clair stuff was somebody else's stuff, until I started to really quiet myself, work on my chakras, work on my shadow work. all of a sudden my clairs started to amplify, and I was like, holy cow, I've got them too. And this is how I began to realize everybody's got this. It's just some of this is been tamped down for various reasons, and we can awaken it up again. Okay, so let's talk about claircognizance next. Now, claircognizance is clear knowing, that's the definition. The messages come through as thoughts instead of feelings. Now, a person who is claircognizant will often say to you, I know because I know, but I can't tell you how I know. That's a very classic claircognizant statement to make. I know because I know, but I can't tell you how. Now, this can be a very, very powerful clair, but often one that's very underestimated. Now, it relates to the second, the third, and the fourth chakras, so it is considered a lower clair as opposed to the next two we're going to talk about are more upper clairs. And some people will also say that claircognizance is connected to the seventh chakra, the crown chakra, which makes a lot of sense since that's connected to our brain and our thoughts and our cognition. Now, the info of a cognizant will often come through and feel as though it's being downloaded. Some people will say it feels like an epiphany. It's just a thought that pops into the head, like a light bulb going off. So, people who are highly creative, people who are very innovative, right? That thought bubble that goes off in above somebody's heads in a cartoon, that I would probably consider that to be claircognizant. It's a thought that just seems to come out of nowhere. Now, I'm going to tell this story that I've told before, but I think it's a very this is a very telling story of how claircognizance works when in a person who didn't realize they were claircognizant. So, how I began to realize that I was claircognizant, it happened in 2019, and um, I had to look for a new house. Our rental house was being sold at the end of the year, and we had a few months to find a new place to live. It's very hard in Los Angeles. It's very hard anywhere to find a home, but in Los Angeles, especially hard. And so I'm not joking when I say that we looked at over 100 different homes. And most of these homes that were in our price range were no place that you wanted to live. And I'm not joking when I say we went into like drug dens, different places like that. There was a house where a tree was busting through the side of the house. So this is what we were looking at day in and day out. And so there was this one particular day that I was driving back from, 13 houses that we had looked at, and I literally had a nervous breakdown in the car. And I was so afraid that we weren't going to be able to find a house in time before our house got sold. And all of a sudden, there was just this very, very calm thought in my mind. And this is a very telling thing about claircognizance. It's very, very calm. And the thought was just, what are you worried about? Because the house that you are going to buy isn't even on the market yet. So you're wasting all this energy worrying. And then the next thought was 1022, 1023. All of this just popped in my head. And back at the time, this was like end of August when the thoughts were in my head. So to make a long story short, I didn't really listen to that. I allowed myself to panic and get crazier and crazier as the next couple of months went on, until one day we walked into a house and I just knew it was ours. And it happened to be on 1021, 1022. I put in the application for the home, 1023. They approved it and we were in escrow. And so this is a very powerful very, very powerful example of how claircognizance works. Now, you would hope that after that experience, I would have trusted myself. But, as you probably know with your own clairs and your own work, it sometimes takes more than just one example. But it's taken me, the last few years after, a couple years after that, I began to really think about how could I amplify this, because obviously I am claircognizant, right? And I'm just disregarding the stuff that's coming through. Now, that leads us to this question, though. It's really difficult to trust this, right? Especially the claircognizance. What's the difference between claircognizance and just imagination or a random thought? I could have made up 1022, 1023, right? So I wouldn't really know that it was my claircognizance until there was proof that came in the physical world later. So it's not always easy, and I don't have a great answer for you that is just going to say do exactly this, but really what it is as you begin to bring your energetic system into balance, you will find that your inner knowing is different than your regular thoughts. It's very calm, it's very clear. People who are really good at claircognizance will tell you it's usually detached from emotion. And in fact, and that doesn't mean it has to be happy stuff either. So that the story I told you was nice, right? That it was that inner voice was saying, don't worry, the house isn't even for sale yet. Stop worrying. Here's the date you're going to get it. But about a month ago or 6 weeks ago, I walked out to, we had an iguana. She passed away about a month ago. And I went out to her enclosure to turn her lights off for the night. And I looked at her and I was like, she's going to die. And that's a terrible thought, right? But it was literally detached of emotion. And I knew that that was claircognizance. I tried to like tell myself maybe it wasn't. It was just my fears or my worries. But it was a very detached thought from emotion. And she did. She died. She passed away not long after that. So it can be negative things, but you're going to notice, like at least for me, is if you have a thought and it fills you with all kinds of anxiety and physical stuff, probably not your claircognizance. It's really a very clear, unattached thought. So how would we optimize claircognizance? Well, one of the best things to do, again, work with the second, third, and fourth chakras. That will help you also with your clairsentience. Claircognizant people can also be clairsentients, so you'll kind of kill two birds with one stone. Now, also like with clairsentience, you would want to record your thoughts, the ones that seem to come out of nowhere. Okay, so not every single thought you have, but the ones that seem to come out of nowhere, record them down in some kind of a record log. And then you can look back at them in a month or two and see if you see any patterns or see which thoughts actually then happened, right? So if I had been recording all this, I would have recorded the thought about my iguana passing away. I would have recorded the thought about the times that, those dates I received about the house. And then I would be able to look back later and see if those events happened or not. And then I can start to tell which thoughts are claircognizant versus which ones aren't. And I start to better understand my own claircognizance. Now, the other thing that's really important for any clair, but especially for this one, is the idea of self-belief. We're going to talk about that a little more at the end. But if this isn't strong in you, then your claircognizance is going to be very cloudy and you're going to have a lot of trouble with it probably until you figure out how to work on your self-belief. Good news is I will give you a tip at the end that I think will greatly help. Okay, so I'm going to check the chat. We're going to move on now to Clairaudience next. But let's see here. Kurt said, I know that I can feel it. I can tell if I want to be around a person rather quickly. So Kurt has good clairsentience that he's tapping into. Jenny said, I get dizzy when talking to some people. It's rare, but does happen. Also have gotten some major headaches while at large magical gatherings. Usually they met in smaller spaces or indoors. So that's interesting too, is that the more enclosed we are, the more tightly packed people are, the more you as a clairsentient might pick up on things, right? And so knowing that can be helpful because it doesn't mean like to not go to spaces that are indoors and kind of tightly packed, but you would know, okay, I may pick up on a lot of stuff when I get there, so I'm going to have some defense strategies in place, right? I'll be able to do like my aura shielding or aura cleansing when I get home or various things like that. Okay, so keep the questions and comments coming. And just out of curiosity, anybody who considers themselves claircognizant can put that in the chat. Or if you're just now thinking that maybe you are, we would love to hear from you too, because you can go 40, 50, 60 years and not have any idea, and then one day kind of realize it. Okay, so let's talk about clairaudience next. Now, clairaudience is clear hearing. Now, this is the first two we talked about were more lower chakra dominant. This is more of a upper chakra clair. In particular, the chakras 5 and 6. So this would be throat and third eye. Now, this clairaudience, and especially in these upper chakras, this is really where we connect to the higher self. So sometimes clairaudience can actually be messages coming from the higher self. Here we deeply and intuitively learn to listen and hear. Now, a common misconception of clairaudience is that you will hear the voice through your outer physical ears. Now, while that is true for some people, most people who are clairaudient will actually hear the voice in the inner ears. And so it's rather easy to tell the difference between a hallucination and clairaudience because of this. Now, what that means though is that people who are clairaudient, especially if it kind of turns on because maybe they were working the upper chakras and all of a sudden it either amplified their clairaudience or it turned it on and they didn't even realize they had it. These people may start to think that they are crazy and that they are hallucinating. But again, it's so it can be very easy to discount, right? But the thing about hallucinations is that unless you have a history of hallucinations, something like schizophrenia, for example, it generally starts in a person's 20s. It's not something that would start in a person's like 40s, 50s, so if a person starts to kind of become clairaudient or like amplify their clairaudience later in their life, it's less likely to be a hallucination because again they don't have that history of schizophrenia or something like that. Now, another way to tell if like a message or something that you're hearing is clairaudient is that usually the voice isn't harsh or tormenting. Now, people who have a lot of hallucinations, like auditory hallucinations, that voice is often very tormenting. It will tell them bad things about themselves. It will tell them bad things about other people. It won't stop. It's a very harsh voice. Whereas a clairaudient message is usually your own voice, and it's not harsh and it's not tormenting. Now, now the other thing that's kind of interesting about clairaudience that a lot of people don't know is that it doesn't even have to be a voice. Messages for a clairaudient person can come through other forms of sound. So, for example, music and song lyrics. So, if you are somebody who has ever heard a song come on the radio and felt that there was a message in it for you, then that is a clairaudient experience. When I was deciding to move to California, there was a lot of questions. Should I go? I mean, I was like, at the time, I was 26, I think, and I was going to leave everything I knew behind me. And my family was very like, what are you doing? I was leaving like a full ride scholarship in a PhD program to do all this. So very crazy. It sounded very crazy to people. And so I had a lot of questions about it. And I remember that every time, like literally every time the radio would come on, it was a song about California. And I felt very deeply that these were messages that were coming through to me that were telling me that the move was the right choice to make. So it doesn't always have to be a physical voice. It can be music, it can be animal calls or cries. Sometimes you may notice that you have a thought, right? And then a crow cries from somewhere in the distance, or you hear an animal make some kind of a noise, and it seems as though that's an answer to your question that you had. People may overhear snippets of conversation that they're passing by that have nothing to do with them, but that one little piece of information actually answers a question that they have or relates to something they're thinking about. Overhearing things kind of on TV as well. All of this can be clairaudient messages. Now, if we want to optimize clairaudience, like I mentioned earlier, it's an upper dominant clair. That means we want to work with the fifth and the sixth chakras. And what we also want to do is probably be kind of proactive in asking for clairaudient messages. And I would say this for any clair that you want to work with, you can be proactive. You can tell your higher self, I'm working on my clairaudience right now. So I would like to receive some messages coming through this sense. Allow me to be open to receive them. You can set that intention. To me, that's the first step here, is just telling your higher self, I'm going to work on this right now. Ask your spirit guides, ask your higher self. And then pay attention to anything that you hear over the next couple of hours. And you can continue to do little experiments like this from time to time. And over time, you will begin to trust yourself more. Um, Now I see that, let me see, I'm going to go back to the chat here. Sonia said that she believes that many of them are turning on and off for her. And that is very common when we are working with the chakra system, when we're doing shadow work. Like I know that Sonia is doing both of those. And so it's very common for them to kind of like amplify. Like I don't know so much like turning on and turning off are not necessarily the words that I would use because they give it this idea that like we can stop them, I guess, and that we can start them again. I think it's really about like turning down the dial. But what will happen is that dial, like it's like we're not tuned in finally enough when we're really out of balance or we're dealing with other stuff. There's a lot of stuck and stagnant energy in the body, got some unconscious stuff kind of that's coming up for us. Then it's going to feel like that's kind of tuned down. We're not really receiving the messages, right? But then we'll go and we'll do some work, and then it will seem like they kind of turn on again, like they tune up. But it's very common for it to feel like they're on and off. And what I would also recommend somebody who's working on them is to notice, when does it feel like they're on? When does it feel like they're off? And notice what's going on for you during that time. You may find that physically your body isn't in its greatest state at the time when it's turned off, like maybe not enough sleep, not eating enough, not moving enough. And then when they're turned on, you're feeling more balanced physically. Amy said, I don't hear voices, but sometimes I get a high pitched sound always in my right ear. Yeah, and so there's like a lot of debate about that. I get that as well, that kind of ringing in the ear, which isn't the same as tinnitus. Tinnitus tends to be like a constant, like just like a constant sound or ringing that people have. But some people do feel that they get like a high pitched ringing in one or the other of the two ears can be a sign that something is happening too. So, what I would recommend is when you get that, log it down as well. Put down the time and the date that it happened, and then see if you're able to connect it to anything that comes next, right? Because otherwise it just feels like I'm just randomly getting this high pitched sound in my ear. But if I'm able to start to connect it to something else, then I will better understand how that, as a form of my clairaudience, is working. Misty said, Clairaudience is my strongest clair. I usually hear them as if they are in the room with me, though not in my head. And so there are people who hear it outside as well. And then she said, I've only heard a male voice in my mind once in my life. Okay, so Claire, so it sounds like the clairaudience for you comes through mostly as an outside voice, and that is not as common as the inner voice, but absolutely happens. Um, Oh, okay. And then Sonia said, when my anxiety is high, I can't turn it down well at all. Okay. And that is often, I've heard that from other people as well. So what that means is that the receiver is too open, right? And this goes for anybody too, like what Misty was saying with like hearing the voices. Like if you ever feel like there's too many clairaudient messages coming through, we can set an intention to kind of tune that down. So same idea with Sonia when she said if her anxiety is really high, she can't really turn it down. You can try to set the intention to say, hey, too much incoming. Let me try to turn this receiver down a little bit or turn the volume down a little bit. But when your anxiety is really high like that, I would recommend working with the root chakra. See if you get the anxiety to come down a little bit, and then I have the feeling that the clairaudience will also come down to a more manageable level. Jenny says, I hear voices, mostly can't understand much. She said, I'll hear doorbells, etc., that no one else hears. Yeah. And so again, it's totally common for a person's clairaudience to kind of work like that, like not really being able to understand any much of it at all, right? Voices that are kind of muffled or we can't understand the message, doorbells that other people don't hear, but we don't really get what they're about. And so again, I would record them and just see if there's any pattern to when they're happening. Otherwise, it just feels like a very random kind of thing for us. Um, but it's really common to hear sounds like that, doorbells, other sounds that you hear other people don't hear. That is usually clairaudience. But again, we don't know what it means until we sort of start to make some sense of it. Okay. So it looks like we've got some clairaudience here. We have some people who are clairsentient, claircognizant as well. And now we are going to talk about clairvoyance. So this is the last one I'm going to talk about, and then I'm just going to mention the less common ones, but they are clair senses nevertheless. Now, our clairvoyance relates to the third eye, the sixth chakra. This is where we see and we perceive visions. Now, we can see them in the physical world, or sometimes we see, perceive things that are not in this physical plane. That would be our clairvoyance. Now, a common misperception about clairvoyance, just like with clairaudience, while there are people who hear the voices outside of themselves, people don't realize that you can also hear it in your inner voice. So the same goes for clairvoyance. Sometimes people think you only have to be able to see it outside of you, but for some, and I should say for quite a few clairvoyants, the images are actually seen through the inner eyes. Now, most of the time, it may, for this reason, it may appear as though it's imagination, which means that people will often discount it as being nothing, right? And so there could be many people who are clairvoyant who don't realize it because they're just simply disregarding these images. Um, the other thing that is true about clairvoyance as well is that it can come through as metaphor. So, for example, a person may, let's say you're talking to someone and then you have this vision of an apple and it doesn't seem to make any sense, but later it connects to, I don't know, the divine feminine or something like that, right? Any symbolism that you would attach to that apple. So it doesn't actually have to be literal translated visions that a person has. It can come through in metaphor. So again, all of this leads us to this question, which is the same question for all the clairs. How do we know it's clairvoyance and not just a daydream or our imagination? And really, the answer is unfortunately, it's not always easy to differentiate, but it requires our practice, our patience, working with the chakras, making sure our energy is balanced, doing our shadow work, making sure that we're grounded. That's especially important for clairvoyance because there's a connection between the third eye and the root chakra. And if a person's pretty scattered, then the clairvoyant visions aren't really going to make any sense. So what I would recommend for somebody who wanted to kind of work with their clairvoyance and maybe they're feeling like maybe I'm clairvoyant or I'm not sure, or maybe they know they are, but it's just nothing that they're able to really use very well. Try candle gazing because candle gazing will tap into the third eye and the pineal gland. Also, a person who is clairvoyant or wants to work with their clairvoyance should pay attention to any images that pop into their heads out of the blue. So the same thing with like all of these other things, like with clairsentience, like a feeling that comes out of nowhere, right? Claircognizance, a thought that pops out of your head, into your head out of nowhere. Same thing with the clairvoyance, image that comes out of nowhere and maybe even seems to be unconnected to the other things that are around you. Now, you want to record and observe these images over time so that you can begin to see some patterns. Um, so anybody who's clairvoyant, I would love to hear from you guys too. And so put that in the chat. And I'm going to just mention a couple of the other clairs. And then I'm hoping to, it was just too much for one episode. So I'm hoping to do another episode in the future where maybe I'll go into more detail with these other four. So there's clairtangency. This is clair touching, or clear touching, I should say. And here people may receive impressions from objects. So I know from talking to some of the people in Body Mind Witchcraft, we have some clairtangents in our group. I personally have a woman that I go to who does like psychic readings for me. And she is a clairtangent. She wears gloves when she appears in public because she picks up too much stuff from handling things. But a clairtangent person will often be able to touch an object that someone else touched and be able to tell you stories about that. But like all of these clairs, it's not always like how would I say this? Um, like calculated or directed. So for example, like let's say I gave you this pen that I had been touching You may not be in control of what comes through. You may hold this pen and pick up something from my past, 4 years ago, right? So it's not necessarily something we can ask a direct question and get an answer from. And unfortunately, that seems to be the case with many of the clairs. Like the information that comes through is not always exactly what we think it will be. But somebody who is clairtangent will be able to touch an object and then will be able to tell you things about the person who once held it or owned it. So very interesting. Interesting way to practice clairtangency too is to have a friend give you an object that belonged to someone that they knew, so that you can ask them for feedback. So, for example, like let's say a necklace that belonged to their grandmother, that means that your friend would know stories about their grandmother. She would know things about them, and um, and then you can get some validation on what is coming through for you through your clairtangency. Now, clairgustance is clear tasting. I don't hear a lot of people who have clairgustance, but it does happen. And this is where people will just get like a taste in their mouth that doesn't seem related to anything that's going on around them. Related to that is clairsalience, which seems to be more common. And this is where people will just smell something. And sometimes it will be smell of a perfume, right, of someone who isn't there, cooking foods, various different things. I always feel like I smell like fish in this one part of our house. There's like no fish there. I don't know what it's about. I've also, when we first moved in here, could smell every once in a while would smell kind of like perfume even after the house had been cleaned, and I attribute that to like a person who lived here before me, whose energy was kind of left here. So if anybody has clairsalience, clairgustance, or clairtangency, we'd love to hear from you guys too. Now, clairempathy is another one. This is clairemotion. Personally, I feel that this falls under clairsentience. People who are clairsentient and can feel energy usually are also clairempathic, which means that they can feel other people's emotions. And again, remember, energy and emotions are just simply a form of energy. Okay, so before we kind of end and move into the Q&A, I do want to just give you some tips overall about working with your clairs. One thing that we want to note here is that as you start to evolve spiritually, as you clear out blockages energetically, emotionally, mentally, you may notice your clairs amplify. You may notice that, like I did, that all of a sudden I have these when I didn't think I did, right? But often we will have to train ourselves in order to really be able to use them. So sometimes people are just, kind of the clair is there. They know from an early age how to use it. That tends to be less common than people who sort of find that they develop them later and don't really know what to do with them. So let us talk about self-belief, because I think that it is such a key here that if you do not believe you can do something, you probably can't. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to. It just means in that state, you are probably not going to be able to do that thing. Um, it is a very contractive state when we're full of self-doubt, when we question ourselves, and our intuition needs expansion. So kind of think of like Jupiter energy, right? Jupiter energy is very, very much about intuition because it's big and it's expansive and it opens us up to all the things that are around us, as opposed to more like Saturn energy, which like sort of forces us to contract, go inward, kind of reflect. That reflection isn't necessarily going to help us with our intuition, but it will get us there eventually. But when we want to open up our intuition, we need to be in that more expansive state. So my best advice for you, especially if you're someone who suffers from self-doubt, and is way more common than we think. So if you are feeling that you are doubting yourself, you doubt your clairs, you doubt your intuition, you doubt any of this stuff, you are not alone. There's way more people who are in that boat than you think. So my best advice is to make a deal with yourself. Some of you have heard me say this before, but it really does work if you try this. You are going to make a deal with yourself that there's going to be no doubting for the next hour, 2 hours, day, week, month, whatever space of time you can handle, that's the amount of time you're going to do. And in the beginning, you just say for a day, today, I am not going to doubt myself. And you're going to make a commitment then to work on one of these clairs while you are in that state of not doubting. You're going to give yourself patience and time because, again, this isn't something you're going to master tomorrow or the next day or the next day. This is going to take some time to master it. And don't expect immediate results, or you set yourself kind of up for, I don't want to say the word failure, but you set yourself up for disappointment when you think you're going to be able to be able to master all of this so quickly. Know that with time and patience and effort, all of this comes in time. Also know that for most of us, the messages don't usually come on demand. That's a sad thing for people to kind of contemplate sometimes. Like they want to be able to use their intuition whenever they want to use it. They want to be able to use their clairs whenever they want to. But for a lot of us, especially in the beginning, the messages are just going to come out of nowhere, and we seem to not really be in control of them. Where we do gain our control, though, is being able to understand what they mean. Now, as you ground yourself, as you balance your energy, as you become more calm and more patient with the process, and you kind of shift your state of mind, more and more and more of this will come for you, and you'll begin to trust the messages that are coming through more and more. So I hope that some of this helps and at least gives you kind of some food for thought to think about. But I'm open. We're open now for some questions. So any questions, comments that people have, doesn't have to be about the Clair senses. Okay, so I'm gonna see what's in the chat, and then I got a couple that people sent me. Okay, but anybody who's here live, put the questions in too. And if you aren't here live, you can put questions in the comments too, and I will go answer those later. Colleen is asking about candle gazing. How does it work? Yes. Okay, so candle gazing is very simple. So the best way to do it usually is to get a table where you can have the candle at approximately eye level. So I sit down like here on the floor when I do it, and I put a small table that I can sit at right in front of me. But you could do this at your kitchen table, do this anywhere where you can get the candle at eye level. Then what you want to do is light the candle. And I recommend turning off all the lights except for like one light somewhere in the corner of the room, like a night light, or I have a salt lamp that I turn on. And it's just to have a little bit of ambient light, okay? So what you're going to do next is you are going to begin to gaze at the candle. You feel free to blink. You can absolutely blink. And what you may find is as you gaze at the center of the candle, your eyes may start to water. It's not uncommon for people to kind of cry. It's not an emotional thing. Their eyes are watering. Your eyes may get tired as you do it, and that's okay. And so what you can do is sometimes all you can do is really just kind of gaze at the candle for 10 seconds. Close your eyes for a second or two, rest them, open them up, gaze at the candle a little bit more. And you're essentially just going to gaze at this candle. I would recommend try it for a couple minutes in the beginning. You can work up to like 5-10 minutes. You don't really want to do it much longer than that. And then afterwards, it's really best if you don't immediately go onto like a screen. We don't want blue light or anything. So candle gazing can be really nice right before bed. Because you can just go into a darkened room and just go to sleep. But if you are not going to go immediately to bed, then what I would recommend doing is allow yourself to rest for about 5 minutes in the darkened room. Maybe even put an eye mask over your eyes, just so you just cut out all light and just rest for about 5 minutes. And then you can get back up and go about your day. But definitely no screens immediately afterwards. And so what I recommend people do is do their candle gazing maybe a couple times a week. Just try it as a kind of almost daily practice. If you could even work up to that, just a couple minutes on most days for a couple of weeks. And the true benefit of this is going to be seen when you do it regularly over some time. And then usually what it's recommended is that if you do it for like 2 or 3 weeks, take a week off and just rest. Okay, and then you can get back to doing it. Okay, So that is candle gazing. Jenny said, I went to a workshop that taught how to pick up energies from items. So some clairtangency, cool. Everyone was able to pick up something. It was very interesting. Yeah, it's really interesting. I've never done anything like that, but I've really wanted to. Because that's like clairtangency is one that I don't feel like I have at all. But again, just 5 years ago, I didn't think I had any of this. And now I'm predicting dates of homes that are being purchased and things like that. So very cool though. I've always wanted to go to something like that. Um, let's see here. What else do we see? Nancy said it's very true. Messages don't come on demand, although I'd prefer to them to come as I need them to. Yeah, exactly. Everybody would, but that's usually the disheartening part is people want to be able to control this, and it's just, unfortunately, it's just not something. It's not in that sort of realm of things that can be controlled. So the best thing we can do is have patients kind of practice, get to know our clair senses really well, and then eventually they may come more on demand. But in the beginning, a lot of times it's just like we're sort of at the whim of when they come through. Sorry, my chat keeps jumping every time boy, it's crazy the way it jumps like that. Candace said, any ideas on how we can practice on our clairs? Um, So there were some ideas shared earlier. I think that for each one of them, my best recommendation would be to record anything that's coming through. I would pick one of the four main clairs and I would sort of spend time practicing that one. So whichever one you think you feel most drawn to, let's say it's clairvoyance, pick clairvoyance and say, you know what, I'm going to work on clairvoyance for the next couple of months. And then what you want to do is record any images that sort of come to you out of the blue so that you can go and look at patterns. And then on top of that, then I would also work with my third eye. Candle gazing can be very good for clairvoyance, but there's going to be a different recommendation for each of those clairs. If you missed the beginning of the video, you probably want to go back and watch it about the other ones. But in general, it's just the best advice would be recording any messages that are coming through for you so you can start to see patterns. And that is going to help you gain some more mastery over it. And then also working to clear your self-doubt. Jennifer said, I just came in, but did you already talk about how to clear some of those blockages besides the self-doubt activity that you just talked about? By blockages, just elaborate on what you mean by blockages. If it's energetic blockages, that's working with the chakras. But in case I misunderstand the question, just clarify on that. Okay, so I'm good. I'm still here to answer questions, but I'm going to move to a couple that were sent to me, and then that gives people time to ask me some more here. Okay, so Odin had a question about working with the inner child. So he said, how do I know what my inner child needs to heal? So very good question, because many people will hear like, I should be working with my inner child. I want to work with my inner child, but I don't know how to. So how would I even know what that inner child needed? Okay, so one place to begin is with shadow work. And with shadow work, the question I would ask is, what did I need as a child that I didn't receive? Or what did I lack as a child that I needed? Kind of the same question, but asked in a different way. And so ask yourself that question, what were the things that you wanted? What were the things you needed that you didn't get? Now those are going to be unconscious places that your child's going to hold energy, right? And so if we can get into some of those ideas, like maybe you needed love, maybe you needed food, maybe you needed somebody to take you places, right? Somebody to listen to, somebody to tell you it was okay. Whatever it is that you needed, that is going to be an area for inner child work. Now, the second thing that I would say about the inner child, especially if you're not as tapped into it, and by asking the question, I would recommend that you get to know your inner child, kind of even divorced from like all the things that we think it needs and how it needs to heal. It's just to get to know it. And one of the simplest ways to do that is to go on an inner child date. Now, the inner child date is where you pick a place, pick a food, pick something that your inner child liked when you were little, or something that you were never allowed to have, like a toy. Maybe there's a toy that you were never allowed to have, and give that to your inner child, or take your inner child to the art store, take your inner child to the toy store, take your inner child to the music store, right? Strum a guitar there, something that your inner child wanted to do, and allow them to do it, and then make it a regular habit. I would try to do it every week or two, at least once a month, going on an inner child date like this. Now, as you befriend the inner child starts to work with you, starts to trust you, starts to understand that, like, you are there to help. You were there to help heal, right? And then that's when some of this starts to come through. You'll start to better understand what parts of the inner child need to heal. The other thing that you can also do is to invite your inner child. Like, let's suppose you already know, like, maybe it's maybe the inner child didn't experience the love and the nurturance that it needed when you were a child. And so you can invite your inner child into your own life here as an adult, where you can also provide it with those things, which is essentially what the inner child date is doing. But making them an ally really, really helps. Okay. So I hope that helps. Let me answer. Billy has a question about tarot. And this is a really good question. So he said, if you use your tarot so much and they become extremely flimsy, do you just buy a new deck? What do you do? Good question, because he then went on to say, like, he really loves the deck he uses. So, and it's been on his mind of what to do with it next. So, at some point, I suppose when you use the cards enough, they become flimsy. They can become, like, especially if some of them get bent, that can sort of throw off the way that you're reading, because the bent cards tend to be pulled more often, and that doesn't have anything to do with, like, them needing to be pulled. They're just pulled because they were bent. So once a deck becomes gets to a point where it doesn't seem to be usable anymore, what I would honestly do is get a new one, get the same deck. If you want to use the same deck again, go find it. Most of these, unless it's out of print, it shouldn't be too hard to find. Consecrate the deck. You still, your energy is in the old deck physically, but the relationship you have with the deck is an energetic one, and you're going to continue to have that energetic relationship with that deck, with the imagery, right, on the new deck as well. So I'm not really worried about that. I feel like once you break the deck in, you're going to feel great. You understand how to read those cards. What to do with your old deck? I think you can create art out of it, and that's what I would recommend, especially because this is a deck that you loved, you cherished, right? And it's very special and meaningful to you. So I have seen a person who got, like, I'm not terribly artistic, so I don't know exactly how they did this, but they got some kind of resin and they put the cards on a table and then they covered it with the clear resin. And so they basically created a table that had, like, all their cards laid out. I purchased at a Goodwill years ago a big picture frame that had all the Rider-Waite cards all mounted in a picture frame. You can get, like, a bulletin board and you can mount them. You can make art out of this because it was something that was so special to you. So that's what I would do. Like, you don't have to, like, sadly retire it, right? You can do something special with it. But then don't feel bad about getting the new deck. You already have a relationship with that deck and you'll be just fine. And then I have a question from Jamie who said, how do I talk to my spirit guides? So talking to our spirit guides, I think a lot of what was talked about in this episode can be useful for a person who wants to talk to their spirit guides, especially because a lot of times spirit guides talk to us through these clair senses. So I definitely recommend, Jamie, to go back and watch the rest of this episode. But to answer your specific question, if you want to work with a spirit guide, the first step is often just intention setting, same kind of step for working with deities. The beginning is setting the intention and putting that energy out there. I am open and I'm interested in having a conversation. So once you set the intention, then you need to learn how to listen for the messages. And sometimes these messages are coming through and we're not even aware that they are. So the rest of this episode will give you some pointers on different ways that the messages that can come through. But I recommend is, being as open and aware as you can be. One thing you can do is play the synchronicity game, which is where you set out a question and you say like, I want to get some answers from my spirit guides for this particular question, and just have a question. And then go out in the world and have some unstructured time. So just try to make it so you have enough time that you don't have to rush back. I recommend going out on foot, but you can also drive around in your car. And then you just search for the first, kind of be open and receptive and search for the first unique and interesting thing that kind of catches your eye, catches your ear, that might have something related to the question. Because our guides, we need to understand how they're communicating with us. And a lot of times it's just through the synchronicities around us in the world. So as we start to pay attention to those, we start to notice more of them. And then our guides also start to see, okay, you're going to talk to me, right? Because we all have guides, and many of us just haven't even been talking to them for years and years and decades, right? And so it's sort of like any person physically you'd be talking to. If they're trying to talk to you and you're not listening, eventually they're just going to kind of like, oh, I'm going to go over here until she starts to listen to again, right? So the same thing happens with our guides. But when we make it clear that we are open to listening, then they will start to send us more messages. So kind of learning to listen to those messages and how they come in for us is going to be especially important. And the rest of this episode will tell you a lot about that. But the other thing I would make sure is grounding and proper care for your body, because if you're not sleeping, if you're not eating enough, if you're not moving, if you're not like physically in a good state, it's going to be really hard to be etherically in a good state to pick up these messages. So there was a person who came to me a while back, had trouble communicating with their guides or picking up on any of their intuition. And as I talked to her further, comes to find out she's sleeping like 2.5 hours a night. She's drinking a lot of alcohol to put herself to sleep. She's not eating well. She's not working out. It's all kinds of stuff. And so all of that is going to set somebody up for a difficulty connecting to guides and hearing their messages. Now, that's a very extreme case, but what it speaks to us all is to really evaluate all those aspects. Am I sleeping enough? Am I in good, am I taking care of my body enough? Because that, when we take care of our physical body, we can open up more into our energetic body as well. Okay, so let me see if I've got any other questions here. Let's see. Jennifer said you mentioned that there were different kinds of blockages that can interfere with the clairs. Yeah, so with the clairvoyance, the blockages are normally in the third eye. With clairaudience, it's usually third eye and throat. So this just kind of helps you pinpoint in on the specific chakras to work. And then with clairsentience and claircognizance, with clairsentience, it's usually second, third, and fourth. So sacral, solar plexus, and heart. Same with claircognizance, but often claircognizance is also the seventh chakra, the crown. So it kind of depends on which specific clair you want to work with, and then that can help you kind of target those specific chakras. And then overall, everybody wants to work with the root, because that is key to our intuition as well. Kurt said, I like to read books and watch movies and try to get lost in the story with my inner child. Awesome. It's great. A great way to take care of your inner child. Okay, if there are any more questions, put them in the chat. I'm just going to let you know what's coming up. So next week on 7/2, I'm going to do an episode on types of magic. I don't have the rest of July planned out yet. So if anybody has any suggestions for me, drop those in the comments or send them to me. I'm always looking for new topics for our future episodes. And so I will see you all next week for that episode. So if you enjoyed what you heard here tonight, make sure to leave a thumbs up or a heart. That helps us get it out into the feed of other people. And also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Body, Mind, Witchcraft. You can watch this replay back on there later. And if you subscribe to the channel, you will make sure that you do not miss any future episodes. All right, it's so great spending this evening with you, and I hope you have a magical rest of your night. Until next time, blessed be.